Okay, so we have the recording going and we're looking at our home screen here. And I'm going to engage my student view and let's just kind of see where we're at. Remember, I always recommend you guys check out the announcements. I had an auto announcement that I was supposed to send out, I want to say yesterday, and it looks like it didn't do it. But you can always catch up to speed on what's going on. Of course, all of our classes, we do the recording and I always post it afterwards, usually 1 or 2 days later. So that's where you'll find the links to those. And of course, when you're trying to see, well, hey, what's due? What's coming up next, right? Well, we came off this spring recess and now it's looking like it's getting a little ugly, right? We got to clean some of this stuff up. And so I'll get that sorted out. Really, what we're getting into this week is engines. A couple weeks ago, we talked about how do engines work, right? 2-stroke cycle, 4-stroke cycle. We went over some of the components like pistons and rings and connecting rods, but didn't get too much into working on the engines, right? Well, one of the things that, pretty much everybody does, and even people that don't even really understand how an engine works, is that people will change their oil on their engine, right? They'll put in some oil. So we're going to be talking about lubrication systems tonight. We're also going to talk about cooling systems and see how much stuff we can get through. And then what I will do is streamline these to just reflect those activities on lubrication system service, aka oil changes, and cooling system service, and what you can do on those. Okay. Hopefully before the break, you guys took your midterm exam, and I was looking at grades and most folks did that and the scores were pretty darn good. So I was happy about that. And we'll start moving forward with some stuff. So it's engine services. Then we're going to move on to a few odds and ends that we haven't got to, and wrap the class up with some engine diagnostics and stuff. But let's shift gears. I'm going to go back to the home page of our course and jump into modules. And we're all the way now. We like week 9 was about engines, of course. And there was all kinds of cool, like learn the parts, that type of stuff there. There was all kinds of cool stuff there, but so we had our spring break and technically our week 10, our 10th week of class, if I can get that out, is going to be on engine maintenance. So I'm going to leave the student view so that we can turn on week 10, because I didn't see that week 10 being activated. There it is. We'll get that going. Boom. All right. So with that, I'm going to change my screen share. And like I said, we're going to look at cooling systems tonight a little bit. But first, we're going to focus on lubrication systems. So let's switch that over. Okay. And with that, I'm going to try to maximize that screen. And we'll do a new share so you guys got the full effect. And let's jump into some stuff here, guys. Obviously, if you didn't have lubrication in your engine, it would not last very long, right? Everything would freeze up and run due to friction. And it's just like if you start rubbing your hands together, they start getting hot, right? And that's friction, right? That same friction helps us stop the car with our braking system. But in the engine, that's not what you want. We have to keep those surfaces from touching and rubbing and creating friction and creating heat. So to do that, we do that with oil, right? So here we have a bearing cap running on a journal, and those things would seize in a short period of time. So what do? We put on some lubrication. Now I got a couple things here on friction. It's talking about like it's all a ratio of, you know, how much force is being applied versus the surface area. And even on your like smooth metal surfaces and components, whether it's the side of a piston or a crankshaft journal bearing surface, under the microscope, like you see in the screen image here, these surfaces are really rough, and they have peaks and valleys and stuff in here. And so they call those different peaks and valleys, they call them asperities. And, you know, at a microscopic level, they're going to rub together, create friction, and eventually heat up the surfaces. As surfaces heat up, they expand, and that's going to cause those parts to seize together. They can literally friction weld themselves together. So our primary method to keep that from happening is to put some lubrication on there. And that means we're going to put some oil on there, and that's basically going to keep these two parts from touching. So let me clear out those drawings here. It seems like one of my pictures here is missing, but we'll go back to this one. So, you know, oil at its basic, you know, standpoint, if I get my drawing tool going here and I lay some oil on this shaft, what it's going to do is it's going to be an intermediate layer that's going to keep this shaft or journal, it's going to keep it from touching the other part. So when our parts are running in our engine, like our crankshaft and rod bearings and all that type of stuff, if I draw this at like a 90-degree angle, so we're looking at it straight on, and let's say here's our main bearing cap, like you see right here, there it is there. And here is the engine. Oh, that didn't work. Guess I better draw it a little bit better. Here is the engine. And of course, we're going to bolt this guy down there, put a couple bolts in there so he's secured. And then here is this shaft in the middle here. Once the engine starts running and it starts building up oil pressure, pressurized oil is going to flow in here, and it's going to basically lift the crankshaft up off the bearing surfaces, and that thing's going to float on a layer of oil. Okay, they call that layer of oil a hydrodynamic wedge, actually. And so the purpose of lubrication, it literally gets in between the two parts and keeps those two parts from touching. And when we have major engine failure, it's usually like the pressure is so high that the parts are allowed to get through that oil layer and have metal to metal contact, which causes them to seize together. So basic purpose of oil is, hey, don't let those parts touch it all, right? Well, but if we break it down a little bit more, and I'll clear out these drawings here. So we talk about it lubricates metal surfaces. Yeah, that's keeping those parts from touching. But a couple other things that your oil does that is super important is that it cools the parts. We actually splash oil over a lot of the internal engine parts, and then the oil drains down to the bottom of the pan, and it might go through an oil cooler. But even if it doesn't, there's air passing over that pan, and that actually pulls heat away from those components. So oil does quite a bit of cooling of your engine. In some engines, like air-cooled engines, that does a considerable amount of cooling. Somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% of that engine cooling is from the oil removing heat from those components. And lastly, and I think this is pretty important, oil also seals around the piston rings and valve stems and stuff. So if I take this piston that's in my hand here, and I do my best rendition to redraw it right here. Remember, the piston doesn't seal up to the cylinder walls all by himself, guys. He has a series of piston rings, right? A top compression ring. He actually has a wiper ring. And then he has an oil control ring here. I'll make that a slightly different color here. This will make that the same color. He has a third ring, an oil control ring. And these three rings work together in a package so if there's any oil on the cylinder walls, which we want some oil so I have a nice smooth surface and I don't have friction, but I got to scrape that oil off and leave just a little bit there for that top ring to have some lubrication. I don't want a bunch of oil up here though, because that would cause the engine to burn the oil during its combustion process, during that 4-stroke cycle, right? When it goes on that power stroke, it would be burning the oil, and we don't want that either. So those piston rings have to work together to seal up seal up the piston to the cylinder walls, but also work together with the oil so that it doesn't seize up, but yet it stays sealed. And so there's sealing that the oil allows the piston rings to do, and that's critical. So the ring package and the oil that goes in the engine, those guys are important, and they work together, certainly. One of our trends that we've seen these days is for engines to go to thinner and thinner oil. So like this oil I have right here, it's pretty thick oil. In that, well, it's a multi-viscosity, so it's 5W40, but that 40 is on the thicker side of things. Most engine oils you're going to see for a new car are going to be a 520 or a 020. As we get oils thinner and thinner, and we have usually low tension, thin piston rings and stuff to match. So anyways, the internal components of your engine, those work together with what oil is going in the engine. And that's why we're going to keep coming back to, as far as what oil should I run in my engine? Well, what is the manufacturer? What are their requirements? What do they recommend? Okay, so let me clear out those drawings, and we're going to keep this thing moving forward. One thing I will say is that in anything of oil, there's always all kinds of additives that they put in the oil to allow it to do its job. Okay, some of those additives are what I have listed on the screen, and I know it's not super exciting, but oxidation inhibitors keep the oil from burning off. Corrosion inhibitors obviously stop stuff from rusting. Detergents keep your internal engine parts clean. Defoamers make sure you have good oil pressure. Pour point depressants make sure that it flows throughout the engine. Viscosity index improvers, those are what give you that multi-viscosity range, whether it's 10W30 or 10W40 or 5W20. So anyways, those give you an oil that has a range and viscosity. So when you buy a jug of oil, whether it's a quart or a gallon jug like I lifted up here a minute ago, you're not just paying for the oil, whether it's a base conventional oil or a synthetic. You're paying also for what additive package do they put in there, and how good is that package, and does it do all the things that the engineers who designed that engine need it to do. All right. So viscosity, it's the thickness of the oil or the fluidity, right? Now, as you can see right here, they've set a couple of temperature standards for this. 210 degrees Fahrenheit on one end and 0 degrees Fahrenheit on the other. So I'm going to write down an oil viscosity here. So let's say I have a very common one that was used for many years and still is used pretty widely, 5W30. Now, we think that the W, like, it makes sense to me that this would stand for weight, right? Or thickness of the oil, the weight of the oil. It actually stands for winter. But hear me out. What that means is if I have a multi-viscosity oil, it would act as a 5-weight oil would act when it's chilled down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And then this multi-viscosity oil is going to act like a 30-weight oil would when it's heated up to 210 degrees. Now, what I want you guys to realize is it's not like the oil's really going to be thinner when it's cold and thicker when it's hot, because a 5-weight oil is still going to thicken up considerably as it gets really, really cold, 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And a 30-weight oil is still going to thin out as it heats up to 200 degrees, right? But what you end up with when you think of the fluidity of the oil is an oil that's has a more even fluidity over a wider temperature range. And that's what you get with a multi-viscosity oil. And that's why pretty much every engine these days is going to want you to run a multi-viscosity oil in that engine. And they're going to specify, they're going to say, okay, this engine needs 5W20. This engine's fine with 5W30. And it might say, well, in really cold and really hot climates, maybe I want you to run a 10W30 or a I don't know, 1040 or something, right? Or in really, really cold climates, we might want you to go down to a 0W20 instead of a 5W30 or something, right? Because a lot of this depends on the ambient temperature that you're running your engine in. If it's really cold outside or really, really hot, of course, that's going to impact the engine's temperature as well. And so we're trying to keep good fluidity of oil in that engine under all its operating temperatures, right? So anyways, that's what's going on with the viscosity. All right, let's clear that out and let's keep moving. So low temp W, we talked about that. Oops. High temp, no letter, they'll use the number. We talked about viscosity. They have a whole setup to measure it, right? It looks something kind of like this, where they look at how fastly it pours out of there and it's heated to the exact temperature. And anyways, all oils, thin out when they're heated and they thicken when they're cooled, right? Okay. So how do we do this? Well, in those viscosity index improvers, what those are in the additive package are actually these little guys called polymers, and they allow the oil to be thinner when they're cold and thicker when they're hot. And they're like long molecular chains. And so when they're cold, these long molecule chains tend to straighten out. But when they get hot, they tend to ball up, and that is what causes them to thicken up, okay? I will say that over thousands and thousands of miles in the engine, right? 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles, over time, these polymers get kind of chewed up. And when they get chewed up, that tends to thin out. So over time, your oil will kind of lose its high temperature viscosity capabilities as the polymer chains get chewed up. And it's kind of interesting. I got to take a class with a guy by the name of Sean Powers, who was an engine builder for Honda. And so what that meant is that Honda, from the factory, like from Japan, they would send Sean engines to the United States, and he would assemble this new designed engine for the first time, very methodically, assemble it, mark everything, put it on the Honda's factory engine dyno test it. And that's where they would go, okay, well, this, V6, 3-liter, whatever, that's going to go in our Accords and whatever cars that they plan to put that in. This thing makes, 210 horsepower at 5,800 RPM, right? Like, he would figure all that stuff out. And what Sean said, he goes, yeah, that, they'd always make more power on old oil than they would on new oil, right? Whatever the recommended oil is, like you know, it wasn't going to make that power on the first couple pulls. If that oil was well ran in, you were usually going to get more power off of that engine. Well, that makes sense because over time this oil is going to thin out. That means it's going to have its viscosity is going to go down a little bit, and with that, of course, there's going to be a little bit less of friction loss, if you will, pumping the oil through the engine, and it can make a little bit more power. So that was kind of interesting. And I will say, like in racing, a lot of times, like for qualifying, guys might use super thin oils in there to try to get every last horsepower moving the car forward. But for the race, that's going to be a whole bunch of laps. They're going to run a thicker oil so it can stand the abuse of the entire race. Anyways, so a little bit in viscosity. Think of that as the fluidity of the oil. And for most intents and purposes, what we want to do, especially if we're working on new cars, they're under warranty, we want to run what the manufacturer recommends. Okay, let's keep stuff going. So we talked about that, different weights. And here's some bottles of oil with different weights. So you can see the 520, 530, all the way up to 2050. Now I want to point something out to you guys on this picture right here. And here it is. All these guys here have this yellow circle in the bottom there. That's the starburst symbol. And that means if you see that symbol, hey, that oil is going to work in the vast majority of engines on the road today is basically what that means, okay? Notice that these thicker viscosity oils don't have that symbol because, you know, if I put that oil in my Prius or something, that I could have some issues. In fact, you know, I had a Chrysler 300, and this is several years ago. The car was from 2010, maybe 2011, right? So that's a 10-year-old car now by today's standards. That car was setting codes for its displacement on demand system. It basically could kill cylinders. It was setting codes for that system because we were running the wrong oil in the engine. The oil that was too thick for what it wanted. It wanted a 520, and the customer, somebody had put in like 1030 or 1040 or something like that, and it was too thick. I think they put in 1040. And because they were gonna go drag race it and stuff, and then after they did that, they were getting codes and they thought they messed something up. It turned out to be the oil, because the oil was so thick that it couldn't bleed down fast enough when it wanted to kill cylinders, and so the cylinder deactivation time was too great, and that was causing it to code up. So, anyways, running the right oil is important, right? The engineers selected that oil for a reason. So this is usually located on the back of your oil container, and it's known as the API donut. So I have an API donut on this oil. That's right here. Oh, let's see if I can get it on the screen. There it is by my fingertip. Anyways, it tells you API. Let me take a step back. One step forward, two steps back, right? API stands for American Petroleum Institute. It tells you the service rating, so that's for spark ignition engines, which would be gasoline engines, if you will. And then it's alphabetic. So SA oil is like old 1960s technology oil, right? Then we went to SB, SC, and here we are over here, we're at SL. And then of course, new bottles of oil, I think are gonna be like SM, something like that. So every time you move up in the alphabet, that's like a kind of a new standard, a new certification standard of oil that now is better than the previous oil. So the oil, even over the course of my career, I've seen oils go from like I wanna say SF, SG, you know, now we're on SL, SM, you know, so oil continues to evolve and get better and better and better. It tells you what the viscosity rating is according to the Society of Automotive Engineers. So that's a pretty important thing. It tells you a lot of the information that you're going to need to know if this oil is the right oil for your car. Okay. So here's a couple of different oils. Again, what you'll notice is the proper viscosity ranges for most cars. The 530, the 1030 have that starburst symbol, but the 1550, even though it's synthetic, does not have that starburst symbol, right? I will say that, like Mobil 1's kind of the standard in synthetic oils. A lot of manufacturers, if they're going to compare their synthetic oil to somebody else, they're going to compare their product to Mobil 1. Mobil 1's pretty darn good stuff. But, there's a lot of great oils out on the market. But Mobil 1 was one of the major players in the synthetic oil game, if you will. Now, speaking about synthetic oil, what's the difference here? Well, synthetic oil has a synthetic base stock, meaning that it is not, if you will, dead dinosaur bones that were in the ground that we pumped out of the ground as crude oil and then refined to make, base oil, conventional oil base, right? This is man-made, if you will. So what that means is that the base stock is going to be more uniform in its molecular size. And what do you get out of this? Well, you usually get oil that can withstand the elements a little bit better. You get oil that can run in the engine a little bit longer before it starts breaking down. It can withstand higher temperatures, and it does better at lower temperatures. So all those things are good. So if you were gonna, be going out to the racetrack on a regular basis, if you were gonna be doing a lot of towing or just running your vehicle hard, or let's say you're going on a big trip and you know that you're gonna be pushing your oil change intervals, all those types of reasons might make synthetic oil the better product for your engine and what you're doing. You generally wouldn't want to run synthetic oil if you're breaking in a new engine. But once the engine is properly broken in, you can then start to run synthetic oil. And it's not a big deal if you could run synthetic oil for the next 10 oil changes. And then let's say you're short on money one time and you run conventional oil. As long as you're changing the majority of the oil all at once and the oil filter, and you're getting all the whatever product of oil out and then switch it over to another one, that's generally speaking okay. What the oil manufacturers don't want you to do is start mixing oils. They don't want you to say, hey, I'm going to use this bottle of Pennzoil and I'm going to use 2 of these Mobil 1s and I'm going to take 3 quarts of red line. They don't want you mixing and matching, right? You're not a chemist here. So anyway, sometimes the additive packages don't play well with each other, and that's why they generally don't want you to do that. Okay. So synthetic oil is great stuff. I will say this with one caveat though. I don't know if it's necessarily better to run synthetic oil and then never change it. And I've seen several people do that. They're like, oh, I got synthetic oil in there. I don't need to ever change it. I worked with a guy and he thought because he had synthetic oil and he ran a Napa Gold filter that he never had to change it again. He would just change his oil filter like every 5,000 miles or something crazy. And remember that the oil still gets dirty. And eventually, even though it's better base product, its additives will break down. And so the oil still should be changed. It'll work better. It won't break down as quickly as a conventional oil, but it still will break down and it still will get dirty. So moving right along. I guess that does bring me to my rule is, how often should you change your oil? Well, my rule is as often as it gets dirty. So if your oil is really dark, black, nasty, if it smells like fuel, I don't care what the mileage is, change that oil out of there, right? Because dirty oil is not going to do your engine any good. So how often do you change your oil? As often as it gets dirty. So if the oil is getting dirty, you should be changing it. Now, if the oil gets dirty really quickly, then you got to ask yourself, well, what's going on? What's causing this level of oil contamination? And you need to deal with that. Now you might be thinking, well, what would cause that? Like, how does the oil even get dirty? All right, well, that means we gotta go back to me drawing a picture of a piston here and throwing that up on the screen here. So here's my piston. Now I'm going to put the cylinder, and don't forget those piston rings there. I'm just drawing 2 rings on this one. Remember that there's combustion happening here at the top. And with the combustion, right, we're burning fuel and we're going to get little bits of carbon coming out. We're also going to get little bits of fuel that doesn't get burned. And so this stuff can get past the piston rings and down into your crankcase. And that carbon, right? Carbon is black. That's why the oil changes from maybe a light brown or caramel color, or maybe like the color of like maple syrup, and it can become black as night, right? It can be really, really dark. Well, that's all that carbon buildup in the oil, right? If you have an engine that's maybe running too rich, we're over fueling it. Again, you're going to get more fuel, more hydrocarbons past the piston rings and in the oil. So dirty oil, that carbon and dirt can embed in your bearing surfaces and your seals and cause excessive wear. So change your oil as often as it gets dirty. That's a pretty good way to go. And what you're going to find is that's going to vary from engine to engine. It's usually going to follow the manufacturer's recommendations. That will end up being somewhere between 3,000 miles to maybe 5,000 miles. To some light duty cases might be as high as 7,500 miles. Again, even if the manual says, oh, you can go 10,000 miles between oil changes. If the oil looks really dirty at, let's say, 6,000, I'd change it out of there. So anyways, that's my opinion on the subject anyways, coming from an engines guy who's concerned about the engine lasting a long time. All right. So there's other classifications. C stands for compression ignition engine. So these are for diesel engines. There's also other performance levels. What I would say is that the manufacturers they're going nuts with all the fluids, right? It used to be years ago, you only had like, a couple different types of oil. Now you have all kinds of different types and different certifications. It's really important on newer cars that you really look at those requirements very carefully. Now, when I say newer cars, this could be, like for the European side of the market, this is like BMWs, Audis, Volkswagens. This is starting really in the early 2000s. So that's not that new anymore. But it was about that time we started to see manufacturers get very specific on what oils they wanted you to use. So that's why my recommendation right here is, hey, always check your owner's manual. So you're making sure you're putting the right product in your engine. And it's critical for a newer vehicle if you're trying to keep that thing covered under warranty, okay? Okay, so we talked about API donut. Energy conserving means that it should give you a little bit more fuel economy. Detergent oil has extra cleaning agents in the oil. Non-detergent oil, I pretty much wouldn't even use non-detergent oil anymore. Maybe for break-in, although they have much better engine break-in oils that are specifically designed for that. So it's kind of going the wayside. I've already been beaten up about oil change intervals. Why do they give you a time limit? The idea is that if you're not driving a lot, so you're not doing a lot of miles, but you're doing a lot of like heat cycles and stuff, you can have moisture condense in the crankcase, which could cause corrosion. So they want you to get that out of there. In our climate here in Sacramento, California, Our climate's pretty dry, so I haven't found that to be as big of a deal. You know, if I had a low mileage car, I might change the oil in it, you know, maybe once a year. I wouldn't do it every 6 months. But if you lived in a very humid climate, like you live down in Florida, then that 6 months makes sense, because you're trying to get some of that moisture out of the engine. Okay, so what I want to do now is kind of go forward and get to like oil change steps and stuff. Remember that the oil, it's designed to like get warmed up, get up to a good temperature, right? Normal operating temperature of, let's say, the engine coolant temperature is around 180, 200 degrees. So the oil temperature gets up around 150 to 180 itself. That's good temperature, and that helps keep the oil clean by burning off some of the lighter compounds, any fuel vapors and stuff. If you're doing a bunch of short trip drives, the oil never gets that hot and it gets dirtier faster. So that's why we talk about short trips being bad for our engines, okay? There is a system called the positive crankcase ventilation system that helps purge those vapors to help the engine, keep the engine oil cleaner. But what we're gonna do now is really get into some of the components, like our oil filters, okay? Every time you change your oil, you want to change your oil filter. Why is that? Well, because the oil filter gets embedded with all that carbon and dirt and junk that's in our oil, and it's a full flow oil filter, so that all the oil going to your bearings and other components first has to go through that filter. So we want to change that thing out of there every oil change. We don't want to risk that oil filter clogging up on us. There is a little valve in here that's designed to open up and let the oil bypass the filter if it is really dirty, because dirty oil is better than no oil, right? But I much rather have oil that's clean going on all my bearings and surfaces. So change that oil filter out of there with every oil change. And I will say also that with your oil filter, how do you tell a good one? Usually a better oil filter will feel heavier in your hand. It will weigh more. Why? Because it has more filtering material on the inside. Okay? It's got more little pleated plates of filtering material in there. It may also have a better metal casing or shell that goes around the oil filter if it's a screw-on or spin-on type oil filter, and not a cartridge style, okay? But whether it's a spin-on or it's just a cartridge style, a better filter will weigh a little bit more because it will have more filtering material in there. So I don't cheap out on oil filters. I try to change my oil on a regular basis, and I also like to run a good quality filter. All right. So beating you up about that, here's a good bunch of shots of different oil filters. These ones that are not in the metal can are your cartridge style filters. And you can see even your cartridge style filters, like this Mobile One or this Quaker State, like if you cut them apart and open them up, then they have this filter cartridge that's on the inside of that can. A lot of our new cars, it's kind of funny. Years and years ago, cars used these cartridge style filters. Then for years, 50 years, we went to the spin-on style, and now we're going back to the cartridge style. So anyways, those K&N oil filters, those are really nice. I like this little socket cap on the end, nice metal shell on there. Anyways, so use a good quality oil filter. Change it when you change your oil, because you don't want to end up like this, right? This is a car that either went way too long in between oil changes, or its oil got really, really hot, okay? Like if the oil got so hot that it thermally started to break down and coagulate, and then it got shut off, this could happen. I've seen that happen on some severe overheats and stuff, where not only was the cooling system compromised and you had all kinds of issues there, but inside the engine, it also ended up doing damage. So anyways, But this can happen just from not changing your oil frequently enough. One of the things I do when I'm looking at a used car or something is I'll take off the oil fill cap and I'll look down in there. Because, you know, if you look just right, you can see some of this valve train action on an overhead cam car. And I want to see how clean does it look in there. If it looks real nasty like this, I'm certainly not going to be offering top dollar for that car, because this car at some point, probably pretty soon, is going to need some major engine overhaul work. So what do you want to see? I want to see this picture over here. I don't want to see that picture right there, right? I want this thing to be all clean on the inside. Now, again, if I had this guy, I wouldn't be offering top dollar for that thing. This was a picture of one that we did some engine flush treatments on, where we ran some different products through there to try to clean out all the sludge, and it worked pretty good. The concern is that you don't get that sludge out of all the nooks and crannies, and that can be problems later on. But I think once the engine gets this sludged up, you're kind of on borrowed time. Like it's a ticking time bomb if something's going to happen, and I'd rather try to get the sludge out than just leave it in there, right? So that's my feeling on that. I have worked with some guys that are like, oh, just leave it alone. You don't want to break the sludge loose. Well, the sludge is eventually going to break loose or cause a problem anyways. I'd rather try to get it out of there. That's my feeling on the matter. All right, so let's get into how do we change it. Remove the oil cap. Remember to use the recommended product, right? The correct weight. Here we got a car up on a lift, but you could get it up on jack stands. We're going to loosen that drain plug. We're going to drain the oil, and I like to drain the oil out when the engine has been warmed up. I don't want it so hot that I'm burning myself and you know, have a safety hazard, but I want it warm because warm oil will drain out of the pan easier, and it will pull more impurities and contaminants out with it as I drain that oil if the oil is nice and hot. So I would like the engine at least warmed up a little bit so the oil drains out nice and quick, and we remove more of those contaminants with the oil. Then when I drain it out, I want to try to get out all the oil that I can in a, you know, reasonable level to remove all that old oil out of there. Then we're going to tighten the drain plug. I'm also going to put a notation on here, though. I'm going to say change the drain plug gasket. Because when you don't, it ends up leaking from there. And don't go crazy tight on that drain plug. We're holding our hand away from the end of the ratchet here, or like far out there. I usually would not hold it that way. We're just trying to take a good picture. I would choke my hand up closer on the ratchet so I don't have so much leverage, okay? So I'm gonna say not too tight. Don't strip out the threads. This is not a wheel lug nut that's holding the wheel on your car. If you looked at the torque spec, it's probably going to be maybe between 5 to 10 foot-pounds at the most, okay? So it doesn't need to be crazy tight. It does need to be tight. What I've seen people do is they put it in, they thread it in by finger, and then they get distracted for some reason. They're like, oh, I'm going to go on break, or I'm going to eat a sandwich right now. And they forget to tighten that drain plug all the way. Okay. So as soon as you put that drain plug in, you get it started in by hand and you tighten that sucker up. Don't let anybody distract you between those 2 points in time, because that's a surefire way to not tighten the drain plug. It sure, as you can bet, will fall out as the customer takes the car and starts driving around, and they'll lose all the oil, and that engine will get roasted really, really quickly. So tighten up that drain plug, not too tight, but tight enough where it's not going to come out of there. Again, you know, somewhere usually between 5 to 10 foot-pounds, it's snugged up on there. Okay, moving right along. Once we got the oil drained and the drain plug back in and tight, now we're going to loosen the oil filter. There we're using a strop wrench on that filter to do that. And we're going to clean the gasket surface and make sure that the gasket did not stick to the side of the engine, that it came off with the old oil filter. And now we're going to apply some oil to the new oil filter gasket. There is a mistake being made though in this picture, and that to me, that looks like we're putting some old oil on that gasket, and you really want to put fresh, clean oil on that filter gasket, okay? Any old oil, remember, it could have some fuel contamination that could affect the seal. So always put on fresh, clean oil on that filter gasket. Wipe it around with your fingertip. Get it all lubed up so it can spin on there and seal correctly. All right, and then we're going to install it. We're going to spin it on, and usually we're going to tighten it about 3/4 of a turn more. What I will say is this, is follow the instructions on the filter. Now you might be thinking, instructions on the filter, what is he talking about? Well, there's usually instructions on the side of the filter that tell you how tight to make that oil filter. Now we're going to fill our crankcase with the right oil. So here you can see us putting some oil in the engine. Once we get it filled up, we're going to start the engine, run it for a little bit, shut it off, check the level again on the dipstick, and top it off as needed. Because as the new oil filter gets then filled up with oil, usually the level will go down a little bit right after we first fire up that motor. Okay. We're also looking for oil leaks and anything like that when we go to fire up that car. Okay. So that's how you get that that oil change done. Let me change my screen share real quick, and we'll switch back to our class real quick. Again, if we look at what do we have on week 10, if I just jump into the assignment, I do have a bunch of great video links here. We have an oil change form, the presentation that I was showing you guys there. So we have that stuff for you. I'm going to add some more stuff to this. I know we're running a little bit long on time, but I wanted to, cover some of that stuff. I think changing your oil is one of the things that everybody's going to do at home or at some point on their car, and it's a good service that even on new cars today that you can do this service. You can do your own oil change, and it's something that's rewarding, and it could save you a little bit of money because if you change, you can spend now. You can still spend $50-$60 just buying the oil and the filter and doing it yourself, right? By running good oil, good filter, all that stuff. But, that same oil change, if you wanted to have that good quality oil put in the engine and the good oil filter, that might cost you $100 or more at a repair shop. So you can still save yourself some money and make sure you get the quality products that you want to be put on your vehicle, right? Some of these oil changes that are advertised really, really inexpensively, like a $20 or $25 oil change, it's usually going to have maybe not the best oil, a really inexpensive oil filter on there. So there is a certain self-satisfaction in doing that stuff yourself. All right, well, we'll at least get started in this next presentation on cooling systems, because I do think that these things really do go hand in hand. So we'll get that up. All right. So, this is a great shot because it shows you a atypical cooling system on an engine. And essentially, what we're doing here is we're pumping coolant through the engine to remove excessive amounts of heat, right? If I allow that engine to get too hot, ultimately what it's going to do is it's going to let the oil get too hot. Once the oil breaks down, everything, friction ensues and everything turns into scrap metal, right? So why can't we run the engine a zillion degrees? Well, because the lubrication can't handle that. Once we lose lubrication, everything else falls apart, right? So there's limits on what we can do. you might have read or heard about race engines running higher temperatures and stuff. And you can do that if you run really exotic engine components and coatings on your parts and really exotic synthetic oils that can handle a lot of temperature. But again, there's always going to be limits on what you can do based on, like, at some point the oil is going to start breaking down and then you're going to get into trouble. So cooling system, we're going to move coolant, which is a mixture of antifreeze and water. In our climate, it's usually a 50-50 mixture. We're going to move that through our engine, through our cylinder heads, our engine block, and then out to the radiator where air can pass over it and we can pull some of that heat away. So the classic is, hey, engine combustion temperatures can be in excess of 4,000, 5,000 degrees. Here's the thing, realistically, only about 1/3 of this heat energy is actually able to get converted into mechanical energy and move the car down the road, okay? The other 1/3 is really the other 2/3, right? The other 1/3 goes out the exhaust system. That's why the exhaust gets so hot, right? And the other third has to be absorbed by the cooling system, okay? So, and if we don't do that, like I said, oil breaks down. Once lubrication breaks down, everything turns into scrap metal, right? So with that, hence we need a lubrication system. So these water jackets surround the cylinders. So here we can see our water jackets here. They're also going to surround the cylinder head, and we're going to move that coolant, that mixture of antifreeze and water, 50-50 mix. We're going to move it through our engine to absorb that heat from the engine, transfer it out to the radiator where the air passing through the radiator then can pull the heat out of the coolant, and then we cycle it back through. So we have to circulate this coolant through the engine constantly as the engine's running. And so we do that through a water pump. A lot of times, you know, really it should be called a coolant pump, right? But what does everybody call it? We call it a water pump. And it's just that. It's a big pump that's driven off the engine, typically. That's driven off the engine, and it moves the water through the engine. Now, why do I say typically? Because there are some cars now that are utilizing electric water pumps. Now, why would I run an electric water pump? Well, it allows me to have very precise control of the cooling system. And when I don't need a lot of water moving through the engine, I could then spin the pump down, and I'm not wasting power running a water pump when I don't need to run a water pump. So if I want the engine to heat up really fast, don't run the water pump, right? So anyways, it gives us more control over the engine temperature. The other way to look at that is it's one more thing that's could be electronically controlled that could go bad and cause severe engine damage, right? So there's multiple ways to look at that one. So anyways, for years and years, this pump was driven by the engine. We're seeing more electric water pumps being used for a variety of reasons. So there's a mechanical water pump. And I do want to point out to you guys this hole right here on the bottom of the water pump. And there's usually a one hole on the bottom. A lot of times there's a hole on the top too. When these seals, when the water pump seals go bad, coolant, which is going to be on this side here, then can leak out and go out that drain hole or that weep hole. It will usually drain down and spill down on the lower radiator hose and then drip down off of that hose. And people will think, oh, my lower radiator hose is leaking. But 9 times out of 10, it's the water pump seals that are leaking. So I always try to find where is that hole and get a flashlight, right? Remember, I keep going how so many things are diagnosed by a good thorough visual inspection. flashlight and a mirror, get a flashlight, get a mirror, find that hole to make sure that there's no evidence of coolant that's been leaping out of that hole. Okay. All right. So moving right along. We'll keep going a little bit more. Of course, if we have a belt-driven pump, it's really important for us to check that belt or belts to make sure that that pump is working correctly and that we don't have it slipping on the belts. And I always like to spin all these pulleys to make sure I don't have bad bearings in an idler pulley or in an alternator or anything like that. So a good part of your cooling system inspection is inspecting your belts, inspecting your hoses. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is pretty basic stuff. It comes down to good, thorough inspection. So if the belt is cracked, if the belts are frayed or misaligned, a lot of times the best way to check all the pulleys is to take the belts off and spin them all, right? So sometimes you think, oh, I'm just going to change the belt, and then you get the old belt off, you spin the pulleys, and you realize, oh, this idler pulley right here, it makes a lot of noise when I spin it by hand. Okay, I need to change that one. If I have a water pump going bad, sometimes the bearings go bad in the water pump. So with the belt off, I can try to move this water pump back and forth, like pull and push on the pulley. And if it's got a bunch of play and stuff in there, I'm going to change out that water pump. Okay, so anyways, I always check that stuff, and I'm always looking for things like leakage around the water pump and frayed belt edges. Those are all signs of problems, or at least potential problems, that you want to address, right, before they become major problems. Remember, if your cooling system fails and the engine is allowed to get too hot, the oil will start to break down and you're going to have major engine failure. That could range from a blown head gasket to bearings that seized up, or any number of things. All of that stuff's going to be expensive. So some engines have very, very high-tech cooling systems where they have little nozzles and passageways on the inside to really channel the coolant where it needs to be, which is great, but that means you got to keep that cooling system clean. So while I'm checking my cooling system, I also look at things like the radiator, and I want to make sure that the passages and stuff in the radiators look clean. So if I peer down through the neck of this thing, I would expect that to be nice and clean in there. If I see a lot of rusty coolant, chunks of stuff, that's going to impact the rest of the cooling system. And I'm not going to just want to change it out of there. I'm really going to want to flush it out as best as I can, which really, there's flush machines and everything else. And I've worked at a shop that was like a custom radiator shop. Like we rotted out and rebuilt radiators and, soldered on end tanks and all kinds of things. And we had very expensive flush machines, but I found that most of the time you could do a better job flushing out your cooling system with a garden hose and a flushing tee than you could with any of those machines. It tends to make a big mess and takes longer, but it does a better job of removing all this rust and corrosion. So if the inside of the radiator looks like this, the rest of the cooling system isn't going to look any better, and you really want to not just change the coolant, but you want to flush it out of there. Okay. So moving right along, there's side tanks on the sides of the radiator if it's a cross flow radiator, or there's a top and bottom tank. There's all kinds of hoses. All that stuff, you want to check it. You want to look for any leakage. Usually when radiators leak, unless something like flew up through your grill and poked a hole in the radiator, it's usually going to leak from a side tank seal, honestly. So those are all things that I check on my cooling system inspection. Now, a lot of these radiators will have like a transmission oil cooler in there for an automatic transmission, or even for the engine oil. So you look at that stuff as well. The heater core on your engine is also almost like a little tiny radiator that's located inside the passenger compartment. So, and that's probably a good place for us to pause at this point, and we'll finish on we'll finish up on that that tech tip about the heater core. This is a great image because when you look at it, you're like, yeah, that heater core there looks like a mini version of this radiator over here. And that's essentially what it is. Okay. We take coolant flowing through the engine and we flow that hot coolant out of there through this heater core. It gets hot. Then it flows back into the water pump, and then it can go out and through the radiator. And from there, it can be cooled down by the air passing over it and go back up through the block. But anyways, we put a little fan inside our dash, right? And this fan is blowing air over the heater core. The heater core is going to heat that air up, and it's going to then blow that air, that warm air at our feet, maybe on the dash panels if that's what we selected. But that's how we heat up the cab of the car, right? So there's a couple of things on this. There's a couple things on here. First of all, if you look at your temperature gauge, and I have hot and I have cold over here, and I'm driving down the road, and all of a sudden I look at it and I go, oh my goodness, the gauge is pegged. It's over here, it's getting hot. What I want to do is I want to turn the heater on full blast. I want that fan moving the max amount of airflow over this little heater core, because when I do that, essentially I've added like a mini radiator to my cooling system, right? So if my engine's running hot, I've just increased its cooling capacity by turning my heater on full blast. And hopefully that will help you get the coolant temperatures down. The other thing I tend to like to do once I notice that hey, this thing's getting hot, is I'll pull over whenever it's safe and I'm able to do so, and I'll spray some water. I won't try to rip the radiator cap off. I will try to spray some water on the radiator to, again, use that radiator to help lower the temperature of the coolant in the engine. And I try to keep it running so that the water pump is moving the coolant through the engine, okay? Now, if you do all that and you're not getting any reduction in engine temperature, it's still getting super hot on you, at some point you might just have to call it and shut the thing off. If you don't get that thing to move down at all, like maybe there's no more coolant in the engine because you blew a line, right? So that's a different scenario. Then you just shut it off. But if you can't get the temperature to come down by turning the heater on full blast and blowing some water over the outside of the radiator, at that point, then I would shut it off. But if I could keep it running and cool it down by water over the outside of the radiator and by running the heater core, I would certainly do that. And the first thing you do while you're driving is turn that heater on full blast. It'll make you uncomfortable inside the car, but it might just save your engine. Okay. And we'll go into some more cooling system tech tips and stuff next week as well. Okay. So let me clear out some of these drawings, and we will let's get this going. Change the screen share there, and you can see that, yeah, there's, still all kinds of stuff to get to on cooling systems. So we'll keep going on that a little bit more next week, because I do think it's an important one to talk about for sure. All right, so let's change this back. Let's bring this back to our class at this point, and I'm just kind of cleaning up my screen. I got 100 windows open here, and it's hard to make sure that I have everything going on properly. So tech tip for the cooling system was, if it's getting hot, turn the heater on full blast, right? Okay, and our week 10 is really going to focus more on the lubrication system than the cooling system. There's going to be an oil change worksheet. There's also a video that you can watch. One of our instructors does an oil change, and you can kind of look over their shoulder in the video and see what they're doing and answer the questions. There's a little five question quiz like always. So we're kind of back to that same general routine. I'm going to extend the deadline for doing the oil change lab out. So if anybody is feeling ambitious and they want to do an oil change at home or something, that they can do that. And so that reminded me about one thing on, changing your engine oil and your tech tip, which is one thing that, I talked about earlier tonight, but I want to make sure that you guys realize this, like the oil change interval is a big deal, right? And so the big thing on that, again, I'm going to type it up here on the screen, is change it as often as it gets dirty. So what does that mean? Well, whether it's been 2,000 miles or 3,000 miles, let's say it's before your normal oil change interval, if you take that dipstick out and you pull it out of your engine and you take that oil, you drip it on a white paper towel, and the oil is really dark brown, it's black. If you smell it and it smells like raw gas, it's time to change the oil, okay? If it's fuel saturated, if it's really dark, I don't care how many miles it's been, your engine is going to thank you by changing it sooner, okay? And then when you go to change it, run what the manufacturer recommends, unless you've done some like extensive engine modifications or something, then that gets you in a different category, right? Like if you have rebuilt your engine, or you took it to an engine builder and they put in different pistons and camshafts and different things, well, essentially it's almost like you're re-engineering this engine, and maybe for that particular build, you're going to want to run a thicker viscosity oil for what you're doing with that engine, or maybe a thinner, so at that point, I would talk to your engine builder, because now it's almost like you're re-engineering this thing. But for most folks, what they're going to want to run is the oil service rating and viscosity index that the manufacturer recommends, okay? So hopefully that gets you guys going the right direction. Before I let you guys go tonight, do you guys have any questions for me? Any questions out there? All right. Well, I hope you guys had a good spring break. I hope you got to spend some time off of your computers. I did. It wasn't voluntary though, but I'm excited to be vaccinated, and that means I feel like I'm one step closer to getting our auto shop at ARC open back up. And that is really, really good stuff. This summer, we're looking at having our skill and speed development class, AT140. We'll have that up and going again. We'll have a few other classes running. In the fall, we'll be running our engine repair class. So if you like this discussion of oils and pistons and all of our engine parts, that 314 engine repair class would be a great class for you to take. And also, if you want to get a jump start, we're going to run a small engines class this summer as well. So, and I'll talk more about that next week, because it is an online class, but we're going to have an option to get a little hands-on as well on that. So I'll talk about that next week. All right, you guys take care. Give me a little bit to get some of these things straightened up. For this week, it's going to be, the oil change worksheet will open up. Really the homework assignment will be the quiz on oils, the 5 questions quiz, because I'm going to leave the oil change worksheet open for several weeks, with the thought that some of you guys might want to end up changing your oil on your own car or something at home, if you have access to do that. And we'll just keep on trucking. Okay. I'm also looking at planning some outdoor activities. We're going to see how everything goes after Easter break and make sure we don't have any changes in the COVID infection rates in our area, but I'm looking forward to maybe planning some activities. So until then, you guys stay safe, keep learning, keep having fun. We'll see you next week. All right. Goodbye, everybody.